I found her in the road at 11:40 on a Tuesday. She was lying face up in the center lane of Route 17, just past the Quingy intersection where the streetlights go sparse and the convenience stores thin out. I almost didn't see her. My headlights caught the shape a second before I would have been on top of her. A woman, flat on her back, arms spread as if she'd fallen straight down from a great height. I hit the brakes hard enough to smell rubber and sat in the car for a moment with the engine running and the hazards clicking and the wipers pushing light rain across the windshield, telling myself I'd imagined it. I hadn't imagined it. I got out, she was maybe 30, hard to be certain. Her face was mostly covered in something I could only describe, in that moment, as film. A translucent membrane, faintly pink, that clung to her skin the way cling wrap melts slightly onto whatever it covers. It was on her hands too, between the fingers, on her throat. Where the membrane was thickest, it had a faint bioluminescence, a cold blue-pink glow that pulsed very slowly, like a heartbeat running down. The substance was warm to the air near it. I could feel the warmth from 30 centimeters away. She was alive. Her eyes opened when I knelt beside her, brown eyes, very clear, very frightened. Her mouth worked under the membrane, and I could see it tearing at the corners, where she tried to open her jaw, the film pulling apart like a scar being reopened. Some of it came away from her lips, in thin strips. She made a sound that was not quite a word, and not quite a breath. Put my hand on her shoulder. I said I was there. I told her I was calling for help. She grabbed my wrist. Grip was surprisingly strong for someone lying in a rain-wet road at midnight covered in whatever that substance was. The grip was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate immediately, too deliberate, too controlled for someone barely conscious. She wasn't grabbing for support. She was grabbing to make sure I stayed, to make sure I heard her. "They are in the sky," she said. Voice had the quality of something that had been used for the wrong purpose and hadn't recovered. Scraped out, like speaking through sand. She said it again, with slightly different inflection, as if she were translating from something she didn't fully have access to. "Above the sky. They are above the sky," I said. "Who is?" But her eyes had already gone elsewhere. They were still open. The membrane over her face went still. I called emergency services. I stayed with her until the ambulance arrived, 11 minutes later. I told the paramedics about the substance. I told them what she'd said. They looked at each other with the particular glance that medical professionals exchange when a civilian has said something they haven't been authorized to address yet. I drove home. I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window with it and didn't drink it. The sky over the city was overcast, low cloud reflecting the orange diffusion of 10 million lit windows, and it showed me nothing. I looked at it for a long time anyway. My daughter Ami was asleep in her room at the end of the hall. She was 11 years old. She had a poster of a beluga whale on the ceiling above her bed, because she had explained to me, with great seriousness the day she put it up. She wanted the last thing she saw before sleep every night to be something that was purely happy. The beluga whale, she said, was that thing I had not argued. It is difficult to argue with the logic of a child who is already, at 11, more certain about what makes her happy than most adults I know. I checked on her before I went to bed. She was breathing. The beluga whale smiled from the ceiling. I did not sleep. The Ministry of Defense contacted me at 7 in the morning. Not the police. Not a hospital follow-up call. The Ministry of Defense, which tells you something about what that woman in the road had been covered in, and how long the relevant people had known about it. A man named Orikasa came to my apartment door. Gray suit, late 40s, a face that had spent a long career learning to give nothing away through deliberate practice. He had a junior aide who carried a bag and never spoke, and a manila folder he placed on my kitchen table, without opening. While I made coffee I didn't offer him. He knew about the woman in the road. He knew what she'd said. He told me the substance was being analyzed, and that I should not be concerned. I asked him what it was. He told me not to be concerned. I told him I'd been awake since midnight, and that I had a daughter sleeping 20 meters down that hall, and that "not concerned" was not a register I had access to currently. So he was going to need a different approach. He looked at me for a moment. Then he opened the folder. The photographs inside showed 3 women, all found in streets, in a field, in one case, in a shallow river outside the city. all covered in the same membranous substance, all found in the early hours of the morning, all within a 40-kilometer radius of central Tokyo. The photographs were dated across the past 6 weeks. In one photograph, the woman was lying, with her hands folded over her chest, the membrane forming a kind of caul across her face, and she looked so peaceful that it took me a moment to process the scale of what I was looking at. I asked if any of them had survived. He said all of them had recovered physically. Their memories of the period before they were found were fragmented, inconsistent gaps, isolated images, no continuous thread. They had all described in those fragmented memories a sensation of elevation, of being lifted, of the sky. He told me the self-defense forces had been tracking an anomalous object in low orbit for 11 days. It was not a satellite. It had no propulsion signature they could identify using any instrument they possessed. It was roughly spherical, roughly the diameter of a 10-story building, and it was cloaked against all standard electromagnetic detection. The only reason they knew it was there at all was a gravitational distortion effect that 2 separate observatories had flagged independently before the data was routed to his office. Flagged and reflagged because neither observatory director believed the first measurement, and both wanted confirmation before they said anything official. He said, "We believe it is collecting material." I said, "Women." He didn't correct me. I asked what they were doing about it. He told me the situation was under active assessment. International partners were being consulted. He told me the priority was establishing communication before any response was formalized. I asked how you established communication with something that abducted women from empty roads in the middle of the night without warning or explanation. He gathered his folder. He told me to contact him if I remembered anything further from my encounter with the woman on Route 17. He left his card. He left. And I stood in my kitchen with his card in my hand and the coffee I'd made going cold and looked at the overcast sky through the window. I thought about what the woman had said. Above the sky, not in the sky, above it. The particular preposition she'd chosen, or been given, or been left with as the only word her damaged voice could shape into the approximate truth of what she'd seen. Thought about it for a long time. 4 days later, Amy didn't come home from school. I want to be precise about the 22 minutes between when she was supposed to arrive and when I understood she was not going to. I want to be precise because those minutes have a different shape in my memory than other time. They are not like normal minutes. They are like a room that keeps adding walls. Every minute I stood in my kitchen, I found another explanation. She stopped to buy something. She walked with a classmate. The train was running late on the Chuo line again. She had her earbuds in and hadn't heard her phone. There was an announcement at school that ran long. Pulled each explanation, open like a door, and looked at the wall behind it. I found another explanation and pulled that door too, and then I saw the shoe, one shoe, her left one, on the hallway floor by the door, the one she'd been wearing when she left in the morning, lying on its side as if it had come off motion, or been placed there by someone who no longer had use for it. One shoe and nothing else. I called Orikasa. He arrived in 40 minutes with 2 people from a unit he did not name and did not introduce. They swept the apartment. They found nothing that shouldn't have been there, and nothing that was missing except for the obvious. They bagged the shoe with gloved hands. Orikasa looked at it through the clear plastic for a long moment before he sealed the bag. He told me they would do everything in their power. I told him I knew what his power had produced in the past 6 weeks, and what it had produced was nothing except better photographs of women in the road. I told him about the fragmented memories. I told him about collecting material. I told him my daughter was 11 years old and not a woman, and whatever the organism was doing up there in that cloaked rock, it didn't know the difference and didn't care. And the international consultation timeline was irrelevant to her. He told me to come with him. The facility was 20 kilometers outside the city, buried underground in a compound that looked from the outside like an agricultural warehouse. Inside it was bright and climate-controlled and staffed by people who moved with the specific tightly wound energy of professionals working a problem that frightened them. There were screens everywhere, orbital tracks, spectral readouts, signal intercepts, rendered as waveforms, maps of the 40-kilometer retrieval radius, with every documented incident marked in red. There were 19 red marks. A scientist, young, small, glasses, clearly hadn't slept in days, walked me through what they had. Her name was Kyokapa, and she had the manner of someone whose precision was a form of comfort, who controlled chaos by naming its components exactly. The object, she told me, was not a conventional spacecraft in any framework they had for thinking about spacecraft. It had no hard surface. Its outer boundary was the membrane substance, the same material that had been on the women in the road. The entire object was the substance. One colonial organism, she said, single-celled, but operating with collective intelligence. Not analogous to an ant colony. Ants have individuals with roles. This was more like a single distributed thought running across a trillion identical cells. No center, no brain to locate, no command structure to interrupt, no individual cell that had more authority than any other. She showed me electron microscope imagery of the recovered membrane samples. The cells were unlike anything in any biology database they'd consulted. They communicated chemically and via very low-frequency electrical pulses. They reorganized rapidly in response to damage. Any disruption to one area of the organism was compensated by adjacent cells within seconds. Conventional weapons would be roughly as effective as trying to stop the ocean with your hands. I asked, how does it reproduce? She adjusted her glasses. Tut. She told me they believed the organism lacked the genetic complexity to generate meaningful internal variation. Too uniform, too perfect at being what it was. What it needed was outside material to introduce that variation. Something with different genetic markers that could be incorporated into the colonial genome and diversify it. And the most efficient local source of that variation was us. The women, she said, were donors. Their biological material was used to introduce variation. The women were not permanently harmed. The organism was not, in the frame of its own logic, doing anything wrong. It was doing what living things do. I said, "My daughter is 11 years old." Kyoka's face moved in a way she didn't control fast enough. I said, "What does it do to children?" She said, "We don't know yet with full confidence." I said, "You have a partial answer. Give it to me." Orikasa said my name. I looked at him. I said, "She is my daughter." I said, "She is 11. I said, "You can tell me now, or I can walk out of here and call every journalist with a camera and describe in detail everything in this room. And the last thing you will have time to worry about is what is in orbit." He looked at me for a long time. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen there before. Not respect exactly, but recognition of a kind. He looked at Kyoka and nodded. Kyoka said the organism accelerated biological processes in a non-discriminating way. She said it did not distinguish between adults and pre-adolescents. She said the children produced from earlier encounters. There had been earlier encounters, documented and classified, going back well over a year, had experienced significant developmental alterations. She said significantly altered and stopped there. I said, "Is she alive?" I said, "Is Ami alive right now?" Ka pulled up a screen. She showed me a thermal scan of the orbital object taken 40 minutes ago. There were heat signatures inside it that matched human metabolic output. There were 17 of them, she said. "We believe the retained subjects are kept in a stable state during processing. We believe they are alive." I sat down. I sat very still. I looked at the scan and the 17 small heat signatures inside the cold rock in the sky, and I thought about Ami and the beluga whale and the specific weight of her against my side when she fell asleep watching something on my laptop and didn't wake up when I carried her to bed. I thought about the school recital I knew by heart. Then I said, "Show me how it retrieves people." Here is what they knew about the mechanism. The organism extended pseudopod filaments from the main body down through the atmosphere, essentially invisible to any detection system currently deployed. No heat signature, no electromagnetic signature, no photonic displacement. Just a column of membrane substance perhaps, a centimeter in diameter, strong as steel cable, flexible enough to navigate around buildings and weather and every obstacle in its path. It located a target. How it selected targets was not understood. It enveloped them in a sheath of substance. The entire retrieval process took under 90 seconds. The target experienced, according to every fragmented account, a sound like a very low note played on an instrument no one could name. Felt in the chest, below the threshold of normal hearing. And then nothing until they woke up in the road. In 18 months of documented encounters, no one had tracked a retrieval filament back to the main body in real time. No one had been inside the object. The women came back because the organism released them. Not because anyone went in after them, I said. The filament leaves residue, the membrane substance. You've been analyzing it for weeks. You know its chemical signature down to the molecular level. Kyoka said. Yes. I said. Can you build a sensor that detects that signature in real-time atmospheric conditions? Directional, portable, she said. Very slowly. The way someone says something when they have been approaching a problem from one direction for weeks, and someone has just handed them a different map, she said. Possibly. Shh. The atmospheric concentrations would be detectable with the right tuning. We'd need to calibrate against the ambient residue from the established retrieval zones, I said. How long? She said, 3 days. Possibly 2 if we prioritize it completely, said. My daughter doesn't have 3 days. She may not have 2, I said it quietly. Not as a performance. As the most accurate statement of fact available to me at that moment. The room received it without argument. Casa said. What are you proposing exactly? I told him. His face gave up its professional neutrality for approximately 2 seconds, which was the longest I'd seen it do that. He said, you are a civilian. You have no relevant training. You have no extraction capability. If the organism retains you, we cannot retrieve you, I said. You cannot retrieve anyone. You have not been able to retrieve anyone in 18 months. That is the current baseline. My daughter is up there, and your assessment has been ongoing for 11 days, and she is 11 years old, and alone in that thing. And I am going in there to get her. What I need from you is the sensor, the gloves your people have been using to handle the membrane samples, and a flashlight, he said. And if it doesn't release you, I said, then I will be the first person who has been inside that thing and survived long enough to look around, and you will have more information than you have now, which is nothing. That's worth something. I know it's worth something to you, or you would have already told me to leave. Long silence. The facility ran around us. Screens updating, people moving, equipment clicking through its cycles. He said, you would need the sensor to find the release filament. To be on it when it forms. I said yes. He said that's the 2 days, I said. Build it in 1. They built it in 31 hours. I did not leave the facility. I sat in a briefing room and drank their bad coffee and read every document they gave me clearance for, and spent most of those 31 hours reading the fragmented interview transcripts from every recovered woman, looking for consistency. 2 things that recurred. The first, warmth. Every recovered woman used some variation of the word, not heat. The organism's interior was warm. One woman described it as being inside something that was alive, which was accurate. Another said it felt like the room had a pulse. The second, the last coherent thought before memory cut out. Every woman who had a child at home, the last clear thing they remembered thinking about was that child. Not the organism, not fear, not any instinct toward their own survival, their child. Shh. One woman had been trying to remember the time of her younger son's school's recital when the memory went dark. That was her last clear thought. The edge of her son's recital. I read that interview 3 times. I sat with it. I thought about what that meant, about what the organism was encountering when it took a mother. I thought about whether it had a category for that. I thought about whether a trillion cells that processed material by chemical signature and electrical pulse had any framework at all for the specific weight of what a mother carried into the dark with her. Not as metaphor, but as an actual cognitive state. A constant background process that ran beneath every other thought like an operating system. I didn't think it did. The sensor they built looked like a modified air quality monitor. Handheld, thick, the size of a paperback with an extra wide spine. It detected the membrane substance's molecular signature in ambient atmosphere and rendered it as a directional pulse on a small screen. Green for presence, stronger signal for higher concentration, a compass needle for direction. The logic of its use was simple. Inside the organism, when a release filament formed, the outgoing version of the retrieval column, which carried processed material back down to the surface, the sensor would detect it, find it. I would be on it. I would be holding Ami when I found it. Casa wrote it on a whiteboard in minimal handwriting and stood back and said, "This is not a plan," I said. "It is the most accurate description of what I'm going to do. Whether you call it a plan is up to you," he said. "I cannot authorize this, I want to be clear. What I am about to give you is government equipment being lent for unspecified civilian use. I am going home now, and I will not be in contact until morning." He handed me the sensor. He handed me a pair of thin gloves. Membrane substance had a mild dermabrasion effect on prolonged skin contact. Nothing serious, but the gloves would help. He handed me a flashlight. He told me the strongest atmospheric concentration of membrane substance residue in the past 72 hours had been within a half-kilometer of the Kwenji intersection on Route 17, the same zone where the woman had been deposited. The organism was methodical in its retrieval zone. He said, "I would go there," he said. "I hope you find her." He left. I stood in the corridor for a moment, put the gloves in my jacket pocket. I checked the sensor battery. I looked at the flashlight. I thought about Amy asleep under the beluga whale, and the empty shoe in the evidence bag, and all the bureaucratic distance between what was happening to my daughter and what anyone authorized could do about it. I went to QNG. I took the train because the car felt wrong. Too enclosed. Too much like something that could pull away. I wanted to be on foot when it happened, if it happened. I wanted to be standing in the open with nothing between me and the sky but air. Kwenji T station was empty. At that hour, the fluorescent lights running at late-night brightness, half the shops in the arcade shuttered. I walked the 2 blocks to Route 17 with the sensor in my right hand and the gloves already on, and my jacket zipped to the collar against the rain. The city made its quiet sounds around me. Distant traffic, a vending machine humming to itself, the train pulling away behind me, and its sound fading into the wet air. Nothing else. I stood at the Kwenji intersection and looked at the sky. There is a specific quality to the sky over a city at 2 in the morning that I had never paid much attention to before. The overcast picks up the ambient light from below, orange and pale gold from the streetlights and apartment windows, and the distant constant glow of Shinjuku, and gives it back as a kind of diffuse ceiling, low and even and without depth. You can't see through it. You can't see what's above it. It just ends the world at a height you could put a number on. And past that number there is nothing visible, which does not mean there is nothing there. 2 in the morning, light rain. 17 was empty. No headlights, no pedestrians, just the wet road and the streetlights and the low orange ceiling of cloud. I stood at the Kwenji intersection with the sensor in my hand and the gloves on, and I watched the screen. The ambient residue reading was immediate and strong. Weeks of retrieval operations had saturated this zone with the membrane substance's molecular signature. The sensor's screen showed a steady green pulse, strong and diffuse. Everywhere ambient, soaked into the air of this intersection the way old smoke soaks into the walls of a room that has been closed for years. The baseline was high. I was not looking for the baseline. I was looking for a spike, a new source, directional, differentiable from the background. I waited. I measured time by counting slowly in my head. Because there was nothing else to do, and because counting gave me something to push against. And 2 and 3. The rain tapped on the hood of my jacket. A bicycle passed at the far end of the block. A delivery rider and the light of his headlamp moved across the intersection and disappeared, and I was alone again. 400. 500. I thought about the 31 hours in the facility. I thought about Kyoka and her precise kindness, and the 17 thermal signatures inside the orbital object, and what it meant that they were warm, that the organism kept them warm, that even something with no concept of a person maintained the conditions that kept a person alive without being asked. I thought about what I'd said to Orikasa when he asked what I was proposing. I had not said, "I am going to board an alien organism in low orbit and retrieve my daughter." I had not said it in those words. Because in those words it sounded like the kind of thing that a person says before something goes wrong. I had described it in the simplest operational terms I could find. The way you describe a plan, when you need the person listening to hear the logic and not the fear. He had heard the logic. He had let me go. I thought about whether that was courage on his part or exhaustion. Thought it was probably both. At 43 minutes the screen spiked. Not ambient, not diffuse. Directional. High angle, north-northeast. I turned to face it and the reading steadied and then climbed. The compass needle on the screen locked. I looked up into the dark sky above me and saw nothing. No shape, no silhouette, no light. Just the orange-gray overcast and the rain. But the sensor told me something was there, high up. Something extending itself down toward this intersection, and I was standing at the bottom of its reach. Something touched my arm. No contact I could see, just pressure. The pressure of a warm hand placed with deliberate gentleness on my left forearm. The warmth the women had described. Not a temperature shock, not cold, warm, and the pressure spread. Up the arm, across the shoulder, and I understood the envelopment was already in process, and I had approximately no time to make decisions about it. So I didn't make decisions. Pressed the sensor against my chest, with both arms folded over it, and I did not fight the contact, and I looked up into the dark and I said quietly, out loud, to whatever was above me, I'm coming for her. The low note. Not a sound exactly. A vibration felt in the sternum, in the back of the teeth, in the spaces behind my eyes. Below hearing. The women had described it right, and then direction became unreliable, and I understood that up was happening. The interior. I don't have adequate language for it, and I've tried. The warmth was real and immediate. Not oppressive. Not the warmth of a fever. Just the precise warmth of something that was alive and large, surrounding you on all sides, wanting nothing in particular from the air you were occupying. The light was bioluminescent, blue-pink, emanating from the substance walls with no single source, filling the space without casting shadows. There was no sense of up or down. There was no echo because the walls absorbed sound. I could breathe. The air tasted faintly sweet, organic, like the exhaled air inside a greenhouse. Not unpleasant. That was one of the things that was hard to hold in my head later. That it had not been a hostile environment. There was nothing in it that wanted me gone. There was nothing in it that wanted anything. In the sense that I understood wanting. It was a living space that had been optimized over a very long time. For the accommodation of living things, and I was a living thing. And the optimization extended to me without acknowledgement. The way a room extends its temperature to whoever enters it. I was in a receiving chamber. Roughly spherical, perhaps 10 or 12 meters across. The walls were the living substance, yielding slightly under pressure, but with structural integrity. The way a firm gel resists a slow push. And from the walls, filaments extended in multiple directions. Not random, organized. Like the root branches of a large tree, each one a passage leading deeper into the organism's interior. The junctions between branches had a different density, slightly thicker, the way nodes in a network have more traffic than the corridors between them. I stood still for a moment. I let my eyes adjust to the bioluminescence. I let the space have its shape. The flashlight was unnecessary. The blue-pink light was sufficient for everything I needed to see. And the flashlight's beam made the walls do something unusual, refracting through the gel-like substance in a way that distorted my depth perception more than it helped. I switched it off and pocketed it. I checked the sensor. The interior was entirely saturated. Everything here was the substance at varying densities. But the sensor was calibrated for differential readings. And there was a corridor of relatively lower concentration running from this chamber, along a filament that led down and to my left. Not an exit. The concentration was still high in that direction, but it was used differently. Less traffic, different purpose. The way a less traveled road in a large building leads somewhere that isn't the entrance and isn't the exit but is where things are stored, or processed, or kept. I went. The corridor required some force to navigate. The walls yielded to pressure but not freely. Like wading through something that was deciding whether to let you through. Kept my arms forward and my head down and I moved steadily. I counted time. I tried to maintain my directional sense, which was difficult in an environment with no fixed reference points and bioluminescent walls that looked identical in every direction. What I had was the sensor reading. Lower concentration meant I was in the passage I'd entered. Increasing concentration meant I'd drifted into an adjacent filament. I used the reading as a thread, keeping it in the lower range, following the differential the way you follow the sound of water when you're trying to find the river in the dark. The organism did not react to my movement through this passage. The bioluminescence stayed steady. That even pulseless blue pink that reminded me, in the back of my mind, of the lighting in hospital corridors at night, when the overhead panels are dimmed and the room runs on the quiet emergency lights, and everything looks like it is just slightly less than real. The walls maintained their texture and temperature. The passage maintained its width. I was allowed to move through it, not because the organism welcomed me, but because it had not yet found a category for me. Retrieved subject was supposed to be sedated and passive in the receiving chamber. A retrieved subject was not supposed to be moving through the filament corridors with a sensor in her hand. I was an anomaly the organism had not yet processed into a response. I used that. 6 minutes in by my count. Slow counting, deliberate, each number given full weight to keep my mind from doing other things. The corridor opened. The chamber was much larger, 40 meters across, perhaps more, with the same living walls but differently structured. Here the walls were organized into recesses. Ovoid alcoves, each one roughly the size and shape of a human body. Each recess was occupied. Inside each one, a human form wrapped in a thin sheath of the membrane, visible through it clearly, because the sheath here was thinner than what covered the women in the road, more transparent, more like a film than a caul. Beneath each sheath, a person breathing slowly, suspended still. I moved along the wall. I read the faces through the membrane. I moved steadily because if I had myself to feel the full weight of that room, 40 people, 40 lives, held in the walls of something that had no concept of them as people, I would not have been able to move at all. The 19th recess I stopped. Ami. I have described faces before, in conversation, in the ordinary way that people describe faces. Oval, dark-haired, she has my jawline and her father's eyes. These descriptions are accurate, and they are nothing. They are like describing the weight of water, by listing its chemical components. I looked at Ami's face through the membrane, and the only word I have for the 20 seconds I stood there is recognition. The absolute specific recognition of the one face in the world that reorganizes everything else around it when you see it. She was still. Her hair was fanned slightly behind her. Her hands were at her sides. She breathed. Pressed palms against the membrane. I said her name. Nothing. No response. The organism's sedation was between her and sound, between her and light, between her and me. I pressed harder. The membrane yielded under my palms slightly and then pushed back. I said her name again, louder. The walls around me didn't change. The bioluminescence was steady. The organism was processing. I looked at the sensor. What I needed was the release filament, the outgoing column that would form at the outer wall of the organism when it prepared to deposit a processed subject back on the surface. That filament would form at the surface, not here in the processing chamber. I would need to find it and be on it when it formed, and I would need to be holding Ami when I was on it, which meant I needed to get her out of the recess first. I worked my fingers into the edge of the membrane around her, the seam where the sheath met the chamber wall, where there was a slight differentiation in substance density, pulled. The resistance was considerable. The membrane had integrity, not rigid, but with the springy resistance something evolved to hold its shape against moderate force. I pulled harder. I felt the wall around me register the disruption. A faint shift in the bioluminescence, barely perceptible, the blue-pink deepening infinitesimally toward a redder tone. Pulled with everything I had. The sheath tore. The sound was felt more than heard. A low vibration through the wall, like a string snapping somewhere deep inside a large instrument. The membrane pulled apart in a roughly oval shape around Ami's upper body, and I caught her as she came forward. She was completely limp, breathing steadily, pulse firm and regular when I checked with 2 fingers against her neck, but sedated to the level of anesthesia. She weighed what she always weighed. Too much to carry easily at my height, but not too much to carry at all, which had always been one of the specific mercies of having a small child. I got her arm over my shoulder and her weight against my side, and I held the sensor in my free hand. The walls were changing. The bioluminescence had shifted, not dramatically, but clearly. The blue-pink had moved toward amber and red, a slow heating of the light that the chamber gave off, and the recesses around me were drawing back slightly into the walls, the organism reorganizing its internal structure around the disruption I'd made in it. The filament corridors, the passages leading out of the chamber, were narrower than they'd been when I came in. The organism was responding. Not aggressively, not with anything I would call anger. More the way a body responds to a foreign object, not with intent but with reflex. The organism was adjusting around the thing it didn't recognize. I moved back toward the entry corridor, roughly, but the corridor had changed. The walls had shifted, rerouted, and the passage I'd come through was now a different shape and direction. I pressed forward along what looked like the next best option. The walls yielded but with more resistance now, the organism's adjustment working against my movement without actively opposing it. Like the mud getting thicker, not like a hand pushing back. His weight redistributed against my side. I kept moving. The sensor in my hand was climbing. Not toward a release filament, not yet. It was reading the general saturation level, which was higher now that the organism was actively reorganizing. I needed to find the outer wall. The release would form there, at the boundary between the organism and open atmosphere. I pressed through a junction where three filament corridors met. The sensor's compass needles swept and settled on a direction. Higher, toward what I estimated was the outer surface of the organism. I turned that way. The corridor narrowed almost immediately, and I turned sideways and moved through it, with Ami folded against me, and the walls pressing on both sides, like something that was trying to understand what I was by touching me. I don't know how long it took. My count had fragmented. I was counting breaths instead of seconds, which is less accurate but more honest about the state I was in. The sensor spiked. Sharp, sudden, the screen going bright with concentration. Directional, upward and to my right, approximately 45 degrees from where I was moving, not the direction I'd been heading. A release filament, forming, not a general rise in ambient concentration. A specific column of high density moving. The organism was preparing to deposit something. The release filament was beginning to form. I changed direction. The wall in front of me was not a corridor. It was a flat expanse of the living substance, no opening, no filament. I pressed into it with my shoulder. The wall yielded, slowly, with resistance, and I forced through it, the membrane closing behind me as I passed. The sensation of passing through something thick and warm and completely indifferent to whether I made it through. I came out into a junction space. 3 filament corridors meeting. The sensation of the outer wall very close. The ambient temperature had dropped fractionally, the warmth of the organism's interior, giving way to something closer, to the cold of high atmosphere, pressing against the outer boundary. The sensor in my hand was maxing. Directional needle was fixed. Above me and to the right very close now, and moving, the concentration reading climbing because the filament was extending, forming, stretching down from here toward the surface. I felt it before I saw it. The same sensation as when it had first touched me on Route 17. The warm pressure, the contact, the specific warmth of the substance making contact with my arm, my shoulder. Only now it was coming from above, and it was flowing down, not up, and I understood that it was a release column in formation, and it was going to go whether I was ready or not. Put my arm through it. The contact spread immediately, up my arm, across Ami's back where she was pressed against me, enveloping us both. I felt her stir slightly, just slightly, the organism's sedation perhaps beginning to thin at the surface boundary, and then the low note hit again. Chest vibration below hearing deep. Direction reversed. Down became the operative direction. Fast, faster than the ascent had been. I felt the temperature drop as the organism's warmth fell away behind us. The cold of high altitude, real cold for a few seconds, and then warming again as we descended, and the city's ambient temperature came up around us. Rain, I felt the rain on my face. I was on the sidewalk, 2 blocks from Route 17. I knew the intersection from the shape of the streetlights, and the particular configuration of the shuttered storefronts, and the way the rain sounded in the gutter. I was standing on a sidewalk in Koenji at some hour that had advanced past 3 in the morning, and I was soaking wet, and my arms were shaking, and Ami was against my chest. I looked up. Nothing visible. Release filament had already retracted back into the sky, leaving no trace except the chemical signature the sensor was still reading as it dissipated in the air around us. Sat down on the sidewalk. I couldn't stay standing. My legs made the decision unilaterally, and I sat down in the rain with my daughter and I held on. I called Orikasa, He answered on the second ring, which told me he had not gone home. I told him where we were. He said, "Both of you?" Said, "Both of us." He didn't speak for a moment. In the silence, I could hear the facility noise behind him. Equipment, movement, the ambient sound of a room full of people watching screens. Then he said he was sending a vehicle. I sat in the rain and held Ami. After 4 minutes, she made a sound, soft, confused, the specific half-syllable she made when I woke her up earlier than she wanted to be woken. Eyes opened partway. She looked at me. She was still in the sedation, still not sure what was real. The edges of her consciousness coming back online, in the slow non-linear way that waking from deep sedation works. Her eyes closed again. I said, "I've got you." Easy, the vehicle arrived. Orikasa stepped out. He looked at me. He looked at Ami. Something crossed his face that his professional training hadn't had time to prepare a response for. Something quick and involuntary, and closer to relief than anything in his official register. He said, "The object is still in orbit." I said, "Yes." He said, "It will keep taking people." I said, "Yes, I know." He said, "We need a real solution." I said, "I know that too. But not tonight." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. He helped me get Ami into the vehicle. He gave me a blanket from the back, which told me he'd brought it specifically, which meant he had believed, on some level, that I was going to come back. Amy woke fully about 90 minutes later in the facility medical bay. She was disoriented in the thorough, uncomplicated way of someone coming out of deep sedation. Not frightened, just uncertain about where she was, and what sequence of events had led her there. She didn't remember anything after the train station near her school. Not the road, not the ascents, not the processing chamber. The memory cut was clean. The organism left nothing behind except the gap. She was not harmed. She was cold and dehydrated, and her blood work showed anomalies that the medical noted carefully without fully explaining until 2 days later, when all results were complete and they had conferred with Kyoka about what they were looking at. The news was as good as it was going to be. Kyoka explained it to me in the briefing room, with her characteristic precision, which I had come to understand was her form of kindness. She gave you the exact truth in the exact words. So there was nothing left to fear in the ambiguity. She said, "There are changes at the cellular level, small variations in a limited number of genomic markers. They are not dangerous. They do not alter any fundamental function. They will require monitoring over time." "What kind of variations?" she said. "Novel markers. The organism introduced them the way it introduces all its variations, as small edits to the existing code. What they express, if they express at all, won't be apparent for years. Possibly decades," she said. "This is what it does. This is what it has been doing. Every person it processes comes back with these small edits. Cross 18 months of documented encounters, and however many undocumented ones before that, it has been seeding these changes into our population. Small changes, accumulating slowly, being passed to children, being passed further." I sat with that. I thought about one thought distributed across 1,000,000,000,000 cells. I thought about the patience of something that operated on a timescale where 18 months was not even the beginning of the beginning. I thought about what accumulating small variations across a population looked like from the inside of a century, 2 centuries, 10. Thought about the women who'd come back. Their children, their children's children, I said. "It's not an invasion." Kyoka said, "No, we don't think it is. Not in any framework we have for that word." I said, "It's something else." She said, "Yes, we think so." I said, "Do you know what?" She said, "Not yet, but we intend to find out." That was 6 months ago. The ministry's monitoring equipment is significantly more capable now. They have a network of sensors across the entire region. The atmospheric detection technology I had asked Kyoka to build in 1 day has been refined and expanded into a real-time surveillance system that covers the primary retrieval zone and is being extended further. They have not yet found a way to stop the retrievals, but they are finding them faster. Response time on the last 2 incidents was under 8 minutes. Both subjects were deposited in their home districts within 4 hours and recovered with the standard fragmented memory and cellular anomalies and no permanent harm. I know that no permanent harm is doing significant work in that sentence, given what Kyoka told me about the accumulated cellular edits. I know that every person who comes back has been changed in ways that won't be visible for years or decades. I know that the organism's project, whatever it is ongoing. But I also know that the alternative, before the sensors, before any of this, was 19 red marks on a map and no response time at all, and women lying in empty roads in the middle of the night with no one looking for them. 8 minutes is not enough. But 8 minutes is better than nothing. And better than nothing is where you start. Casa calls me every few weeks. He updates me on the international whole picture, which has expanded in ways that neither of us find surprising. There are anomalous orbital signatures over other cities on other continents. There are other recovered women, other fragment memory reports, other cellular anomaly findings in blood work databases that only became interpretable once Kyoka's team published their initial analysis through channels that Orikasa described, with characteristic understatement, as restricted but broadly circulated. There are other ministries of defense conducting assessments. There are other consultations with international partners. For us, there is still no communication with the organism. There is still no framework for that. There may never be one. Not because the organism lacks intelligence, but because the intelligence it has is too different in kind to share a channel with ours. It does not use language. It does not use signal. It does not use anything we emit or receive at any frequency we've measured. It uses chemistry and electricity at the cellular level, distributed across 1 trillion identical cells. And whatever that produces in terms of something resembling thought is entirely internal and entirely untranslatable. Kyoka told me once, in a moment of uncharacteristic frankness at the end of a long briefing call. It may simply be that this organism does not have a concept of communication with the outside. It has been doing what it does for a very long time, longer than we can measure with confidence, and in all that time, it has never needed to talk to anything. It just proceeded. It proceeded the way the tide proceeds, without consultation, without negotiation, without any awareness that the things it was moving over had their own experience of being moved over. I thought about that for a long time after the call ended. I listened to his reports. I answer Kyoka's questions when she forwards them through him. I am not a scientist, and what I observed inside the organism has limits as data. My memory of the interior is imperfect and emotionally loaded, and probably unreliable, in the specific ways that first-hand accounts of extreme experiences are always unreliable, distorted by what you needed to see and what you were too frightened to look at directly. I tell Orikasa what I remember. He writes it down. Something of what I saw in that processing chamber has contributed to their current models of the interior organization. And that contribution, however small, is the only useful thing I have to give. It is the least I can do for the other 19 women who are still in there right now, waiting for the organism to decide they are finished. Waiting for the receipts that will put them back in a road somewhere and leave them with a gap in memory and a change in their blood they won't understand for decades. Orikasa has told me that his team is working on an intervention. Something that can interrupt the retrieval process. Something that can get to those women without waiting for the organisms to release them on its own schedule. He uses careful language when he describes the progress, which tells me the progress is slow. I don't press him. I know what it's like to be working a problem that frightens you with tools that were built for a different problem. I am not afraid of the organism. I want to be precise about that because I know how it sounds. It is still up there. It is still taking people. It's taken 4 more since Ami and I came back. All of them now found quickly because of the better sensors. All of them returned within hours. All of them carrying the cellular at its home in their blood, like a letter they haven't opened yet. But I am not afraid of it. In the same way I was not afraid of the rain in Kuenji when I was standing in it at 2 in the morning. The rain was real, and it was cold, and it was coming down on me regardless of what I thought about it. Fearing it wouldn't have changed its temperature or its direction. What mattered was that I knew what it was. What mattered was that I had looked directly at it, had been inside it, had navigated through it, with my arms out and my eyes open and come back with what I'd gone in for. Fear is what you have before you know what something is. After you know, you have something else. Not courage. That word is too clean for what it actually feels like. Something more like a specific knowledge of the distance between what you were afraid of and what you can actually survive. I Have thought about this many times in the 6 months since, in the specific way that you think about things late at night, when the city is quiet and the apartment is still, and the fan at the end of the hall tells you that your daughter is in her room and asleep. I have thought about whether the sequence of events is the whole story. The organism encountered something in that chamber it had not encountered before. A subject who was not sedated, not still, not in the recess where she'd been placed, not complying with the processing she'd been slotted for. A subject who had torn another subject out of a recess and was moving through the interior looking for something that the organism had no name for, and no chemical marker for, and no way to locate. A subject who was not trying to survive, who was not fleeing, not hiding, not performing any of the behaviors that the organism's models, built over a very long time of observing living things, would have predicted for a biological entity inside something that could consume it. A subject who was trying to get somewhere, to reach something, with a specificity and a stubbornness that had no optimization function behind it. No survival instinct, no propagation drive, no calculation the organism could match against its existing categories. I wonder, sometimes, whether that was the thing it didn't know how to hold. Whether somewhere in the distributed thought of a trillion cells, there was a moment of incomprehension, a gap where the pattern should have been, a variable that failed to resolve because the variable was a mother looking for a daughter and not stopping. Will not know. There is no way to ask. What I know is this: Ami is fine, she goes to school. She has started a notebook about cetaceans that she carries everywhere and annotates in a handwriting that gets smaller and more deliberate the more she cares about what she's writing. She does not remember the inside of the organism. She knows something happened. She knows it involved the sky. She knows I went to get her. She knows it had something to do with the gloves she found in my jacket pocket a week after we came home. She held them up and looked at me with those brown eyes and said, in the direct and economical way that she approaches most things, "Mom, did you do?" I told her. "I went and got you." She thought about this. She is a child who thinks before she speaks, which has always been one of the things I have loved most specifically about her. The way she holds a thing in her mind before she gives it to you. Then she said, "Okay, thanks." She went back to her notebook. I stood at the kitchen window with the gloves in my hand. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. A real clear, stars visible through the break in the overcast. The city below them lit and alive, and completely unaware of what hung above it, and what it had been doing for longer than anyone had known to look. The sky went up and up, and at some point in that upward distance, there was an invisible rock filled with living warmth and blue-pink light, methodically running its ancient project through the cold dark above our heads. I looked at it the way you look at something you understand now. Not with fear, not without respect, just with eyes open, with the knowledge of what I'd been inside, and what I'd taken back out of it, and what neither of us had left behind. Amy asleep at the end of the hall, the beluga whale smiling from her ceiling. That's enough. That has always been enough.